I woke up in a private hospital suite after suddenly collapsing during dinner. Behind the half-open door, I heard my best friend whisper, "Are you sure she took it?" My husband let out a quiet laugh, saying to relax, as by tomorrow morning, everything would be theirs. My blood ran cold, so I picked up my mobile phone and texted my solicitor 3 words. "Execute the plan now." The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the expensive kind. It was the kind of silence that only exists in private Marylebone hospital suites, where wealthy people recover behind closed doors and thick walls. I stared at the ceiling for a moment, trying to understand where I was. My mouth felt dry, my head throbbed, and a dull ache lingered behind my eyes. Then I remembered dinner, the wine, the sudden dizziness, and the floor rushing toward me. A nurse had probably explained everything at some point, but whatever medication they had given me had left my memory blurry around the edges. I slowly turned my head to see that the room looked more like a luxury hotel than a hospital. There was a leather sofa by the window, fresh flowers on a table, and a giant television mounted on the wall. Through the glass, I could see central London glowing beneath the evening sky. For a brief second, I wondered if I had simply worked myself too hard. I had spent most of my adult life building sterling logistics from a tiny haulage brokerage into a company operating across 12 counties. Stress came with the territory, but then I heard the voices outside. The rest happened exactly as I remembered it. The whisper, the question, the answer. And suddenly, every strange feeling I'd had over the past several months began arranging itself into a terrifying picture. I picked up my mobile phone to find there were 23 missed calls. Most were from my assistant, 3 were from my solicitor, and 1 was from my private investigator. I immediately texted my solicitor to execute the plan now, and 3 dots appeared almost instantly. Finally, that was all he wrote back. Not what happened, not "Are you okay?" Just 1 word. Finally. He responded that way because he knew, and because for months, we'd been preparing for this exact possibility. I placed the phone down and closed my eyes, realizing the strange thing was that I wasn't crying. I wasn't even shocked anymore, because deep down, I think part of me had been preparing for betrayal long before I was willing to admit it. My name is Beatrix Sterling, and I'm 54 years old. Until recently, I believed I had everything: a successful company, a beautiful home in Richmond, financial security, a husband I'd been married to for 12 years, and a best friend I'd trusted for nearly 30. Her name was Cressida, and we met during our 2nd year at Durham University. She was funny, outgoing, and fearless. While I spent my 20s building businesses and chasing impossible goals, Cressida seemed to float through life effortlessly, working in marketing for years, moving between companies, and eventually starting to consult independently. We were opposites in many ways, and maybe that's why we stayed close, or at least that's what I used to think. As for my husband Julian, when I met him, he was charming, attentive, and refreshingly different from the ambitious executives who constantly surrounded me. I was already successful, already wealthy, and already exhausted, but Julian made me laugh. For a while, that felt like enough, and the first few years of our marriage were genuinely happy. We traveled, hosted dinner parties, spent weekends sailing on the Solent, built traditions, built memories, and built a life together. Or at least I thought we had, until the first crack appeared almost a year earlier. It wasn't because of another woman, but because of money. And looking back, that's what I should have paid attention to. Julian had never shown much interest in our finances, preferring to let accountants and advisors handle the details. Then suddenly he became curious, very curious, and he started asking a lot of questions. He wanted to know how my estate was structured, and what would happen if something happened to me. He asked who controlled the voting shares of the company, whether I had a will, and if I had a trust in place. At first I laughed it off, telling myself it is perfectly normal for people in their 50s to talk about estate planning. Then the questions became more frequent, more specific, and increasingly persistent over time. One night while we were having dinner at home, he asked whether my board of directors could remove me if I became incapacitated. I remember putting down my fork and telling him that was an oddly specific question. He smiled and said he was just curious, so I smiled back, but something about it stayed with me. A few weeks later, I noticed another change when Cressida started appearing absolutely everywhere. At first, it felt natural as she came to charity galas, joined us for dinner, showed up at our Cotswolds cottage, and dropped by the office. Then she started texting Julian frequently, far more frequently than seemed remotely necessary. Whenever I mentioned it, Both of them had explanations that sounded completely reasonable. They were too reasonable, in fact. And I remember standing in my kitchen one morning while Julian showered upstairs. His mobile phone buzzed, the screen lit up, and a message preview from Cressida appeared. It read that she couldn't stop thinking about last night, causing my stomach to tighten instantly. Then another message arrived immediately afterward, saying the marketing proposal was brilliant and thanking him again. I stared at the screen, thinking maybe there was an innocent explanation, but I knew something had shifted. For the first time in years, I felt uncertainty creeping into my marriage, yet I didn't confront him just yet. Instead, I did what I'd always done whenever faced with uncertainty, which was to gather information first and deal with emotions later. 3 weeks after that message, I hired a private investigator, the best one in London, a former National Crime Agency officer named Alistair Vance. I still remember our first meeting as we sat in a quiet coffee shop in the city. I felt ridiculous even being there, as though I was betraying my own marriage just by speaking to him. Alistair listened carefully, and when I finished speaking, he folded his hands together. He asked me what I wanted him to find, and I hesitated before honestly answering that I hoped it was nothing. He nodded slowly, noting that most people do hope for exactly that outcome. At the time, I thought I was hiring him to confirm my fears were completely unfounded. I had no idea he was about to uncover something far worse than a simple illicit affair. By the time I lay awake in that hospital bed months later, listening to my husband and best friend discuss my death, I already knew my marriage was built on lies. What I didn't know yet was just how far those terrible lies actually extended. And neither of them realized that the moment I sent that text message, their future had already started collapsing. 3 months before I woke up in that hospital room, Alistair Vance walked into my office carrying a thin black folder. At the time, I thought he was bringing me evidence of an affair, but I was entirely wrong. He was bringing me evidence of something much bigger, and the folder sat on my desk between us. Afternoon sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bustling streets of central London. Outside, lorries bearing my company's logo moved through the yard below, drivers loading freight and dispatchers coordinating routes. Normally, watching that activity made me feel incredibly proud, but that day, it made me feel strangely vulnerable. Alistair didn't open the folder immediately. Instead, he took a moment to study me closely. "Before we do this," he said, he needed to ask me a very important question. I folded my arms and asked him what it was he needed to know. He asked whether I wanted the truth or if I just wanted comfortable reassurance. I didn't answer right away because I understood exactly what he meant by that distinction. Reassurance was comfortable, but the truth had the power to destroy absolutely everything in my life. I finally told him I wanted the truth, so he nodded, and then opened the folder. The first photographs weren't surprising, and while they were painful to look at, they were exactly what I expected. They showed Julian and Cressida entering a boutique hotel in Mayfair and leaving together 3 hours later. There were pictures of dinner dates, weekend trips, private dinners, hand-holding, and kissing captured over many months. It was months of evidence, with every ugly detail carefully and meticulously documented by the investigator. I stared at the photographs without speaking, and strangely, I felt far less emotional than I expected. Maybe it was because somewhere deep inside I had already known the truth for quite some time. Women often know long before they are finally willing to admit the reality to themselves. The signs are always there, from the late-night texting to the unexplained absences and the sudden emotional distance. They also provide excuses that almost make sense, but only just almost make sense. Alistair remained totally silent while I carefully studied each of the photographs in front of me. Finally, I looked up at him and asked how long this had been going on. He told me it had been at least 14 months, and that number hit harder than the pictures themselves. 14 months meant more than a year of birthdays, holidays, anniversaries, family gatherings, and business events. They had carried on all while they smiled at me, and all while they sat at my own dinner table. They did all of this while gladly accepting my complete and unwavering trust. I closed the folder, and for several seconds, neither of us spoke a single word. Then Alistair said something entirely unexpected, stating that the affair wasn't the part that concerned him. I looked up and asked him exactly what he meant by that alarming statement. He slid another document across the desk, which turned out to be bank statements that belonged to Julian, not me. Several large transfers had appeared over the previous year, including cash withdrawals, wire transfers, and highly unusual transactions. I frowned at the papers and asked him what exactly I was looking at. Alistair leaned forward and told me that was exactly what he was trying to figure out. My stomach tightened, because until that moment, I had been preparing myself for betrayal, not danger. I asked him to explain, and Alistair tapped one page of the financial documents. He said Julian's behavior didn't fit the profile of a typical cheating spouse at all. I asked what profile it did fit, and his brief hesitation scared me more than anything he'd shown me. He said it looked like someone preparing for a major financial event in the near future. The room suddenly felt significantly colder as I asked what kind of event he meant. He looked directly at me and said it was the kind where a large amount of money changes hands. I stared at him for a moment and then laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because it sounded ridiculous. I asked if he thought Julian was planning to divorce me and take my money. Alistair shook his head to indicate no, and the smile instantly disappeared from my face. I asked what else it could possibly be, and he replied that he didn't know yet. That answer bothered me far more than absolute certainty ever would have done in that moment. Unknown threats always have a way of unsettling the mind much more than known ones. Over the following weeks, Alistair continued investigating, and the deeper he dug, the stranger things became. One evening after a long board meeting, I sat alone in my office, reviewing quarterly reports when my mobile phone rang. It was Alistair, and he said he needed to show me something right away. His voice sounded unusually serious, so an hour later, we met in a private conference room. He brought another folder with him, and this time it was noticeably thicker than the first one. Inside were transcripts, screenshots, photos, financial records, and various handwritten notes he had compiled. I read everything twice, and then I went back and read it all a third time. By the end of it, my hands were trembling, but not from fear. It was from pure disbelief. Cressida and Julian weren't simply having a sordid little affair behind my back. They were discussing my finances constantly, covering my estate, my trust documents, and my company shares. They also discussed life assurance policies, board governance, inheritance laws, and topics that made absolutely no sense. It made no sense for two people supposedly engaged in a romantic relationship to focus on these matters. One particular message stood out, where Cressida had texted Julian to ask if he was sure I'd leave everything to him. Julian had responded by saying that eventually, it simply wouldn't matter at all. I read that specific exchange several times because the wording absolutely haunted me. I asked Alistair what exactly that was supposed to mean, but he just shook his head. He said there was no proof, but if he were me, he'd start protecting everything immediately. That very same week, I contacted my solicitor, Gideon Croft, whom I trusted implicitly. We had worked together for nearly 15 years, and he specialized in corporate law, estate planning, and asset protection. When I explained the grim situation to him, Gideon listened carefully without a single interruption. Then he stood up and firmly closed the heavy door of the conference room. He warned me that what he was about to say might sound rather extreme. I nodded and told him to go ahead and speak his mind freely. He told me I needed to assume the absolute worst regarding their true intentions. The heavy words settled ominously between us in the quiet space of the room. He pointed out that I had significant assets, a controlling interest in a large company, multiple properties, and investment portfolios. He leaned forward, explaining that if someone wanted access to those assets, they would have a very powerful motive. I felt physically sick, not because I disagreed with his assessment, but because I simply couldn't. For the next 2 months, Gideon and I worked quietly, and I mean very quietly. There were no dramatic confrontations, no emotional scenes, and no wild accusations thrown around. There was just preparation, and careful, methodical legal maneuvering to secure my entire livelihood. We reviewed every asset, every account, every document, and every ownership structure I possessed. By the end of the exhausting process, most of my personal wealth was protected through trusts. These were legal entities that Julian knew absolutely nothing about and couldn't touch. Everything was done lawfully, everything was meticulously documented, and everything was designed to survive a divorce or worse. The strange part was that Julian never noticed what was happening, not even once. He remained completely confident and almost cheerful throughout the entire passing of those months. Looking back, that unshakable confidence should have absolutely terrified me to my core. People are often most dangerous when they fully believe that their victory is inevitable. A few weeks later, another conversation with Alistair changed everything all over again. We were meeting in an underground car park beneath a central London office building. It felt absurdly dramatic, like a scene pulled straight from a gritty crime thriller. I almost laughed out loud when I first arrived at the gloomy underground location. Then Alistair handed me a report, and suddenly absolutely nothing felt funny anymore. A background search had uncovered several online purchases connected to an account Julian occasionally used. The purchases themselves weren't strictly illegal, but they were concerning, very concerning indeed. Alongside them were internet searches, medical queries, chemical inquiries, and questions about substances difficult to detect. There were questions about specific symptoms and incredibly detailed queries about precise timing. I stared at the printed pages and then slowly looked up at Alistair's face. Neither of us spoke for several long, suffocating seconds in that cold, concrete space. Finally, I asked the dreadful question neither of us actually wanted to answer. I asked if he genuinely thought Julian was planning to physically hurt me. Alistair chose his subsequent words with the utmost care and professional caution. He said he thought I was dealing with someone whose intentions might be far worse than infidelity. That night, I barely slept as I lay awake beside Julian while he breathed peacefully next to me. For hours, I stared into the darkness, remembering holidays, remembering anniversaries, and remembering old promises. I was desperately trying to reconcile those warm memories with the cold evidence piling up around me. The two versions of my husband simply no longer matched up in reality. One of those versions had to be a complete and utter lie. The terrifying part was that I just didn't know which one it was yet. What I did know was that whatever sick game Julian and Cressida were playing, it was approaching its end. And for the very first time, I began preparing not just for a divorce, but for actual survival. The hardest part wasn't gathering the evidence. The hardest part was the constant pretending. It was pretending I still trusted my husband, and pretending I didn't know my best friend was sleeping with him. It meant pretending everything was perfectly normal, while my entire life quietly shifted beneath my feet. Every morning, Julian kissed me goodbye before leaving the house for his day. Every evening, he asked about my day with a perfectly practiced look of interest. Sometimes he brought me flowers, and sometimes he suggested weekend trips away. Sometimes he looked so completely ordinary that I almost convinced myself Alistair had made a terrible mistake. Almost, but then another piece of damning evidence would arrive to shatter that illusion. It would be another text message, another photograph, or another hidden financial record. Then reality would return, sharp and unforgiving, to remind me of the true danger. One rainy Thursday morning, Gideon Croft sat across from me in a private conference room. He slid a thick stack of formal legal documents across the polished table toward me. He announced that this was the final structure we had been working so hard to build. I looked down at the paperwork that represented months of grueling, secretive work. It contained trust agreements, corporate restructuring, asset protection documents, and updated estate planning instructions. Every single detail had been reviewed repeatedly, and every possible vulnerability had been addressed. If Julian believed he would inherit my fortune someday, he was about to discover a very painful truth. Most of what he so desperately wanted was already completely beyond his greedy reach. It was secured legally and permanently, locking him out of my life's work. Gideon folded his hands together and told me that once these were signed, my position became significantly stronger. I picked up the expensive pen lying next to the stack of pristine papers. For a brief moment, I hesitated, but not because I doubted the decision itself. It was because signing those documents felt like accepting something I had spent months trying to deny. My marriage was completely over. Not officially, not yet, but emotionally, it had already ended. I signed every single page, and then Gideon carefully gathered the documents together. He then asked a personal question that genuinely surprised me in that professional setting. He asked me how I was holding up under the weight of it all. I laughed softly, but it was a tired laugh, the kind that comes strictly from deep emotional exhaustion. I told him that I honestly didn't know how I felt anymore, and that was the absolute truth. For months, I had been operating exactly like a CEO managing a critical crisis. I was reviewing information, making decisions, building contingency plans, and forcing myself to stay purely rational. But underneath all that rigid discipline was grief, real, agonizing, and profound grief. It wasn't just grief for my ruined marriage, but for the future I truly thought I was going to have. At 54, I wasn't just mourning a relationship. I was mourning an entire version of my life. It was a version of my life that simply no longer existed in reality. That evening, I returned home much later than I usually did from the office. The house was quiet, beautiful, incredibly expensive, and feeling entirely empty inside. Julian wasn't there. so I stood alone in the grand kitchen, staring blankly at the marble worktops. I suddenly remembered the happy day we had originally bought the property together. We had walked through unfinished rooms, wearing hard hats, arguing about paint colors, and laughing about furniture while making plans. Back then, absolutely everything felt possible and the future looked incredibly bright. Now, every single memory I had within those walls felt fundamentally contaminated. My mobile phone suddenly buzzed, interrupting my thoughts, and I saw it was Alistair calling. He asked if I could talk, and 5 minutes later, we were on a highly secure call. His voice was unusually serious as he informed me that something had recently changed. My stomach immediately tightened as I demanded to know exactly what had happened. He said he thought they were getting impatient, and I sat down heavily on a stool. I asked him what he meant, and he reminded me that for months they had been very careful. He paused before adding that now they were actively starting to take risks. Alistair explained that Julian and Cressida had become increasingly reckless in their behavior. They were meeting more frequently, discussing finances more openly, and actively making future plans. Their behavior suggested confidence, a dangerous confidence of people who believed they were close to getting what they wanted. I asked him what kind of future plans they were actually making together. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the secure line. Then Alistair finally answered, telling me they were planning a life after me. The chilling words landed squarely in my chest like a brutal physical punch. It was life after me, not life without me, which was a very subtle difference. However, it was a terrifying difference that completely changed the nature of the threat. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat alone on the back patio. The London skyline shimmered in the distance, and the Thames flowed calmly nearby. The evening air smelled faintly of rain, and normally, I loved evenings exactly like that. Instead, I felt completely disconnected from everything and everyone around me. I kept replaying one single burning question over and over in my tired mind. I wondered why. Not why Julian cheated, because people cheat every single day. It's an ugly truth, but it's common enough in the circles we moved in. I meant something much deeper. Why wasn't a simple divorce settlement enough for them? Why weren't they simply leaving to start a new life together somewhere else? Why was there all this extreme secrecy and an absolute obsession with my money? Why were they having such strange, detailed financial discussions behind my back? Why were they conducting medical searches that hinted at something incredibly sinister? I wondered about the growing sense that something much darker was actively happening right now. I didn't have the answers to those terrifying questions just yet. A week later, something happened that changed my entire perspective completely. It all started rather innocently with a casual lunch meeting request. Cressida invited me to a small, exclusive restaurant near the River Thames. I almost declined the invitation, but my overwhelming curiosity eventually won out. She arrived wearing a bright, practiced smile and very expensive designer sunglasses. This was the same woman who had proudly stood beside me at my wedding. She was the same woman who had held my hand weeping after my father's funeral. She was also the same woman secretly sleeping with my husband for over a year. Watching her actively perform the role of a loyal friend felt entirely surreal to me. For nearly an hour, she chatted brightly about ordinary things like holidays, clients, home renovations, and mutual friends. Then, she casually asked a question that made my blood run cold. She asked if I had updated my will recently, and my fork froze halfway to my mouth. For a split second, I genuinely thought she might be able to hear my racing heartbeat. I forced a polite smile and casually asked her why she wanted to know. She shrugged and claimed she was just thinking about getting her own affairs organized. It was a lie, an incredibly obvious lie, and we both knew it. But neither of us openly acknowledged the falsehood hanging heavily in the air. I answered carefully, telling her that my solicitor handles all of those matters. She nodded in response, and then changed the subject as if the question had never happened. That single, brief conversation disturbed me more than any photograph Alistair had ever shown me. It was because, for the first time, I experienced their cruel deception firsthand. It wasn't through evidence or detailed reports, but directly, face to face. She sat directly across from me, pretending to care deeply about my future well-being. All the while, she was quietly calculating exactly how to financially benefit from my death. I drove back to my house in Richmond, shaking violently with intense anger. It wasn't fear anymore. It was pure, unadulterated, and righteous anger. For many months, I had felt deeply hurt by their ultimate betrayal. But that afternoon, something fundamental changed within my very soul. The lingering hurt finally hardened, and it officially transformed into unyielding resolve. That evening, I called Gideon and told him we needed to be completely ready. He assured me we were, but I clarified that I meant absolutely and completely ready for anything. He understood my meaning immediately, and the tone of his voice shifted. The next several weeks became an intense blur of constant, high-stakes preparation. We implemented additional legal protections, emergency directives, financial safeguards, and corporate contingency plans. Every possible scenario was examined thoroughly, and every conceivable possibility was addressed. Gideon called it defensive planning, but I preferred to call it building impenetrable armor. By the time we finally finished, the master plan was truly enormous in scale. It was far bigger than Julian could ever possibly imagine or comprehend. It was also far bigger than Cressida could ever hope to dismantle. And yet, still, none of us had definitive, undeniable proof of an actual murder plot. We had incredibly strong suspicions, circumstantial evidence, obvious patterns, and dire warnings, but not proof. That missing piece of the puzzle frustrated everyone involved, especially Alistair. Then, 3 days before I ended up in the hospital, he called with unexpected news. He told me he thought something was about to happen very soon. I immediately sat upright in my chair and asked what made him say that. He said they were celebrating, and that completely unexpected statement confused me. I asked him what on earth they could possibly be celebrating right now. He said he didn't know, but he paused before delivering a chilling observation. He noted that guilty people don't usually celebrate before starting an affair. My pulse quickened as he said they celebrate right before a massive payoff. For the next 72 hours, I couldn't shake the terrible feeling that a massive storm was coming. And unfortunately for me, my instincts were proven absolutely right. 3 days after Alistair warned me that something was coming, Julian invited me to dinner. Under normal, happy circumstances, the invitation wouldn't have meant anything unusual. Married couples frequently go to dinner to celebrate milestones and reconnect after busy weeks. They spend quality time together to maintain their bond and share their lives. But by then, absolutely nothing about my broken marriage felt remotely normal anymore. He told me that morning in the kitchen it would be just the two of us, while pouring coffee. He promised there would be no work, no mobile phones, and absolutely no distractions. He smiled at me, using the exact same smile that had once made me feel entirely safe. It was the same smile that now made me constantly wonder what dark secrets he was hiding. I studied his face carefully and asked if he had really planned all this himself. He said of course he had, kissed my forehead, and claimed he missed his wife. The romantic words should have deeply touched my heart in that quiet morning moment. Instead, they made my stomach tighten with dread, because for months, every romantic gesture had felt strategic. Every single kindness he showed me felt entirely rehearsed and utterly hollow. Every expression of deep affection came with invisible, terrifying questions attached to it. I wondered why he was doing this now, what had changed, and what he truly wanted. Still, I verbally agreed to go, not because I trusted him in the slightest. I agreed because I desperately needed concrete answers to my lingering questions. And sometimes answers only appear when deceitful people believe they've already completely won. That evening, Julian drove us into central London to one of the city's most exclusive dining establishments. The expensive restaurant overlooked the Thames and catered to wealthy executives, politicians, and rich tourists. We'd celebrated several happy anniversaries there before, in the earlier years of our marriage. The specific choice of venue felt highly intentional, almost sickeningly nostalgic on his part. It was as if he were deliberately recreating a much happier version of our fractured marriage. The well-dressed hostess led us to a highly sought-after private table situated right near the large windows. Soft, elegant music played quietly in the background, while expensive candles flickered on the tables. The glowing city lights reflected beautifully across the dark water of the river. Everything looked absolutely perfect, but to my eyes, it all looked far too perfect. The waiter brought our drinks, and Julian confidently ordered my favorite vintage wine without even asking. It was yet another small detail that felt strangely and coldly calculated. We talked, or at least we pretended to engage in a meaningful conversation. He asked about the logistics company, and I asked about his current consulting projects. We politely discussed our mutual friends, upcoming charity galas, and future holiday plans. They were entirely normal conversations, yet simultaneously completely artificial conversations. We were just two actors reading from a stale script that neither of us actually believed. Halfway through the lavish dinner, Julian reached across the table and gently touched my hand. He looked into my eyes and said he had been thinking a lot lately. I forced a warm smile and jokingly replied that thinking was a dangerous habit. He laughed softly, and then his carefully constructed expression seemingly softened into genuine affection. He told me that I knew we had built a very good life together over the years. The loaded statement hung heavily in the air between us for a moment. I slowly nodded in agreement, and quietly confirmed that we indeed had. For a brief, fleeting moment, genuine sadness seemed to cross his handsome face. Or maybe I just desperately imagined it because I wanted to see it. Even now, after everything, I'm still not entirely sure if it was real or an act. The human mind desperately searches for traces of humanity in the people who cruelly betray us. Sometimes those tiny traces are actually real, but sometimes they're just sad, wishful thinking. The exquisite food finally arrived, and I ate my meal very carefully. It wasn't because I actively suspected poison, at least not on a conscious level. It was because my survival instincts had been screaming warnings at me for months. Instincts tend to notice subtle things long before logical thought ever catches up. It could be a strange taste, an unusual smell, or just a deeply uncomfortable feeling. I couldn't precisely identify what bothered me, only that something absolutely did. I drank very little of the expensive wine and took only a few small bites of my dinner. I remained highly alert to my surroundings and to Julian's every single movement. Then, about 40 minutes later, the entire room suddenly seemed to shift around me. At first, it was quite subtle, manifesting as a slight dizziness and a strange pressure behind my eyes. I blinked several times, hoping to clear it, but the dreadful sensation didn't disappear. Instead, it rapidly intensified as my racing heartbeat dangerously accelerated in my chest. The restaurant lights suddenly seemed blindingly brighter, and the ambient sounds around me became distant, muffled, and distorted. Julian immediately leaned forward across the table and urgently called out my name. I looked at him, and intense concern completely filled his familiar face. It was a perfect, highly convincing concern that any loving partner would display. It was the exact kind of deep concern an innocent husband might show in an emergency. Or, it was the exact kind a completely guilty one might expertly fake. I managed to say I was fine, but the words sounded strange even to my own ears. My tongue felt incredibly heavy. My chest tightened painfully, and sheer panic flickered briefly in my mind. Then, my years of professional training simply took over my failing body. Years of leading a major company had taught me one absolutely crucial thing. When something feels fundamentally wrong, you must always pay close attention to it. I reached for my mobile phone beneath the table without drawing any attention to myself. I did it without making it obvious and blindly sent a single desperate message to Gideon. It simply read, "Dinner, something's wrong," and thankfully, the crucial message went through. 30 seconds later, the room violently tilted, and then absolutely everything went black. The next thing I remember was waking up in the private Marylebone Hospital suite. I remember hearing the damning voices, finally hearing the absolute truth, and sending my second decisive message. That text explicitly told my solicitor to execute the plan now. Back in the present moment, I lay perfectly still in the sterile hospital bed. Outside the private room, Julian and Cressida eventually walked away down the corridor. Their hushed voices faded entirely, and the long hallway became totally quiet once again. I waited for several long minutes in the silence before finally making my move. Then I picked up the phone and called Gideon, who answered almost immediately. He told me he got my text, and his steady voice was remarkably calm. It was almost too calm, which meant he was already hard at work on our strategy. I asked him exactly what we knew so far about the situation. He replied that we knew significantly more than we did just yesterday. I closed my heavy eyes and told him to explain everything to me. Gideon explained that after I collapsed, the ambulance crew had rushed me to a private central London hospital. Routine blood work conducted by the doctors had already raised some very serious concerns. The medical team had found traces of a toxic substance they couldn't immediately explain. Additional, highly specialized testing was currently underway to identify the exact poison used. My pulse quickened as I asked him to confirm that I wasn't just imagining all of this. He gave me a simple, terrifying confirmation without any hesitation or uncertainty whatsoever. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke a single word into the phone. Then Gideon continued, noting that Alistair had also been incredibly busy while I was out. That piece of information immediately got my full attention despite my groggy state. I eagerly asked what our investigator had managed to find during the chaos. Gideon replied that he had found a lot of new information, Apparently, while I was completely unconscious, Alistair had obtained critical additional evidence. He secured financial records, encrypted messages, recent purchases, and incredibly damning new information. It firmly connected both Julian and Cressida to highly dangerous substances that neither had any legitimate reason to ever possess. It was still somewhat circumstantial and incomplete, but the case was growing stronger by the hour. I asked my solicitor what exactly would happen now that we had this proof. Gideon's firm answer was immediate and filled with professional determination. He told me that now we officially stopped playing defense and took the offensive. For many agonizing months, we'd been meticulously preparing, protecting assets, and patiently waiting. Now absolutely everything in the situation was actively changing in our favor. The final, essential piece of the complex puzzle had finally arrived to save us. It was clear intent, not just mere suspicion or distinct possibility, but proven intent. We had evidence of people discussing my death and their future after my demise. They were actively discussing whether I had taken a toxic substance or not. No jury in the British justice system would hear those words and think they were discussing a surprise birthday party. Gideon then clearly outlined the first phase of our aggressive legal counterattack. Emergency filings, protective orders, massive financial freezes, and corporate safeguards were all initiated. Every single mechanism we'd built quietly over those terrible months would activate immediately. It wouldn't happen tomorrow or next week, it was happening right at this very moment. By the time sunrise hit London, Julian's entire world would begin totally collapsing. He just didn't realize it yet as he slept soundly in his bed. After hanging up the phone, I sat quietly in the comforting darkness of the room. The intense anger I'd carried for so many months still remained within me. But another, much lighter emotion had finally joined it in my tired heart. I felt immense relief, because the agonizing uncertainty was finally, permanently over. For months, I'd lived entirely inside terrifying questions, but now I had solid answers. They were ugly answers and incredibly painful answers, but they were answers nonetheless. The hospital door suddenly opened unexpectedly, and a friendly nurse entered carrying my medication. She smiled warmly at me and said it was very good to see me awake. I genuinely returned her smile and agreed that it was very good to be awake indeed. Those simple words carried far more profound meaning than she could ever possibly realize. Because somewhere in London, two arrogant people truly believed they were about to inherit absolutely everything. Instead, they had just unwittingly triggered the total destruction of their own future. And by morning, the first devastating consequences of their actions would finally arrive. The first person to truly panic was Cressida, though I only learned that detail later. At the time, I was still in the hospital, sitting upright in my bed. Outside, London slowly woke up beneath a typical gray, overcast morning sky. A light rain tapped softly against the thick glass of the hospital windows. The bustling city looked totally calm, incredibly ordinary, and completely unaware of the drama. It had no idea that two deceitful lives were about to drastically unravel. Gideon arrived just after 7 o'clock, carrying a smart leather briefcase and 2 cups of coffee. The very moment he entered the private room, I knew something significant had occurred. His professional expression was highly focused and strictly controlled as he approached my bed. However, directly beneath that strict control was a deep sense of undeniable satisfaction. It was the specific kind of satisfaction that solicitors rarely show unless they know for sure they're winning a major case. He handed me a warm cup and politely asked how I was feeling today. I simply replied that I was feeling remarkably alive. He smiled faintly and noted that staying alive was becoming increasingly important for our strategy. I took a slow sip, and the hot coffee tasted absolutely wonderful to me. After surviving the trauma of the previous 24 hours, even completely ordinary things felt incredibly precious. I eagerly asked him to tell me exactly what had happened while I slept. Gideon opened his briefcase and calmly stated that absolutely everything had happened. For the next hour, he meticulously walked me through the dramatic events of the long night. The master plan we'd spent so many months preparing had activated flawlessly immediately after my text message. First came the absolute lockdown of all the financial protections we had established. The bank accounts, massive investments, corporate controls, and extensive property interests were all secured. Everything moved seamlessly and exactly as we had carefully designed it to do. Formal legal notices had already been officially filed with the relevant authorities. Emergency injunctions and protections were firmly in place across the board. All previous access points were abruptly closed, and all potential vulnerabilities were fully secured. If Julian expected to casually inherit a vast fortune, he was about to discover a massive shock. He would soon find out that the fortune no longer existed in the form he foolishly imagined. At least, it certainly didn't exist for him to ever touch or claim. Then came the second, highly aggressive phase, which involved the mountain of gathered evidence. Alistair had worked tirelessly through the night to compile the final damning dossier. Every document collected over the past months was perfectly organized and swiftly delivered. There were extensive mobile phone records, hotel bookings, financial transactions, and electronic communications. The massive file contained thousands of pages, providing a complete, undeniable roadmap of their cruel deception. I listened very quietly to the update, and then I asked the question that mattered most. I asked him whether the doctors had learned anything more since we'd last spoken. Gideon's usually calm expression darkened significantly as he prepared to deliver the grim news. He told me the full laboratory results had finally come back this morning. I held my breath as he confirmed exactly which toxic substance they had identified in my system. The hospital room became deathly silent as the terrifying reality of his words sank in. It wasn't because I was surprised this time, but because hearing the confirmed specifics spoken aloud made everything undeniably real. Even after that first phone call, a small part of me had still been desperately clinging to denial. It was a tiny, utterly irrational part of my brain that refused to accept the horror. But after hearing those confirmed test results, that innocent part of me existed no more. I asked him exactly how serious the poisoning attempt had actually been. Gideon exhaled slowly and told me the doctors believed the dosage was potentially fatal. I looked away toward the rainy window, trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal. For several long seconds, I simply couldn't find the strength to speak. Potentially fatal was such clinical language, yet it carried such terrifying, life-altering meaning. Someone had actually, genuinely tried to violently end my life for financial gain. It wasn't metaphorical. It wasn't just emotional damage. It was completely literal. The person who did this was someone I loved, trusted, and who slept beside me. I closed my eyes tightly, trying to block out the overwhelming pain of the revelation. When I finally opened them again, Gideon was watching my reaction very carefully. He gently asked if I was okay, and I slowly nodded my head in response. I told him that eventually, I would be entirely fine, and surprisingly, I truly meant it. It was because the crushing grief was already rapidly transforming into something else entirely. It wasn't bitter hatred, and it wasn't even a burning desire for bloody vengeance. It was clarity, pure, unadulterated, and crystal clear clarity regarding my life. The brutal truth always strips away comforting illusions, very painfully, but entirely completely. Around noon, Alistair arrived at the private clinic to give his final report. Unlike Gideon, the investigator looked absolutely, bone-wearingly exhausted from his long night. His tie was completely loosened, his eyes were bloodshot, and his coffee cup was empty. It was a clear sign he had probably consumed 3 more cups already that morning. I casually remarked that he looked absolutely terrible standing there in the doorway. He laughed dryly and admitted he'd had a rather busy night dealing with the fallout. Then he walked over and dropped a thick file onto the table beside my hospital bed. It was another folder, but this time, it was the final, definitive folder. He pointed at it and declared that this contained absolutely everything we needed. I opened it very slowly, bracing myself for the shocking contents inside. Inside was the exact evidence we'd been desperately missing all these months. It was the undeniable evidence that firmly transformed mere suspicion into absolute, legal certainty. There were printed text messages, very recent messages, and incredibly damning exchanges. Some of them had been exchanged only hours before my sudden collapse at the restaurant. One particular message made my stomach turn completely upside down in disgust. Cressida had texted him to say that tomorrow changes absolutely everything for them. Julian had eagerly replied, stating that they were almost there at the finish line. There was another horrifying exchange where Cressida declared that after this, nobody could stop them. Julian had simply and chillingly replied with one word: nobody. I stared blankly at the printed words on the page in front of me. They were simple words, completely ordinary words, yet somehow more chilling than anything else. This was because they clearly revealed extreme confidence, eager expectation, and sick anticipation. People simply don't write like that to each other right before filing for a divorce. They only write like that to each other right before claiming a massive, illicit victory. Alistair pointed to another highly sensitive document located further down in the thick stack. He told me there was even more evidence to review, pointing to more financial records. Only this time, the specific transactions connected directly to a very dangerous supplier. The supplier was currently under National Crime Agency investigation for illegal chemical distribution. My pulse quickened drastically as I looked up and asked if he was kidding me. He grimly replied that he sincerely wished he was making it all up. The quiet hospital room fell completely silent once again, as we absorbed the sheer gravity. Finally, Gideon spoke up to deliver his professional, calculated legal assessment of the situation. He stated with absolute certainty that civilly, Julian and Cressida were entirely finished. Alistair firmly nodded in agreement, and added that criminally, they were getting very close to that point. That very afternoon, detectives from the local CID arrived at the hospital. They were highly professional, exceedingly polite, and entirely methodical in their approach. They sat by my bed and interviewed me thoroughly for nearly 2 full hours. I bravely told the police officers absolutely everything that had happened over the past year. I detailed the affair, the investigation, the financial questions, and the highly suspicious behavior. I even recounted the chilling conversation I had overheard right outside my hospital room door. I provided every tiny detail, every growing concern, and every ignored warning sign. When the intense interview finally ended, one detective carefully closed his official notebook. He looked at me and said, "Mrs. Sterling, you've been remarkably prepared for this." I almost laughed out loud at his choice of phrasing. Prepared was such an odd, inadequate word to describe the absolute hell I had endured. Nobody ever actually prepares for this kind of betrayal to happen to them. Nobody simply wakes up one day and decides to build an elaborate legal defense against murder. But I completely understood what the detective actually meant by his statement. Many months earlier, I had been forced to make a very difficult choice. I could either ignore my nagging instincts, or I could fully trust them. That single choice had almost certainly saved my very life. Late that same evening, another incredibly important telephone call arrived. This time, it was from one of my company's most senior board members. An emergency board meeting had been successfully held earlier that day. All of our planned corporate protections were now fully and legally active. My essential leadership authority remained entirely secure and unchallenged at the logistics firm. There was no business disruption, no market uncertainty, and absolutely no opportunity for Julian. He couldn't exploit anything, and when the call ended, I felt something new. I felt a profound sense of peace that I hadn't felt in many months. It was real, deep peace, but not because the terrible situation was completely over. It was peaceful because the situation was finally, unstoppably moving toward proper justice. The very next morning brought the first massive public consequences for the guilty pair. Julian was formally served with comprehensive divorce papers simultaneously in multiple locations. There were multiple legal filings, and multiple aggressive legal actions launched against him all at once. The sheer surprise was immediate, and the ensuing panic was even faster. According to Alistair, Julian spent most of the day desperately contacting various expensive solicitors. He then frantically called his bankers, his financial advisors, and anyone else he knew. He reached out to anyone he thought could possibly help him fix the disaster. However, the legal answers he received were always exactly the same across the board. Absolutely nothing could be reversed, nothing could be accessed, and nothing could be claimed. The complex trust structures protecting my massive assets were entirely legal and fully enforceable under British law. Months of meticulous planning had utterly defeated years of cruel manipulation. Cressida's panicked reaction to the sudden fallout was reportedly even worse than his. She reportedly called Julian's mobile phone dozens of times in a state of absolute hysteria. Neither of them could comprehend exactly what had happened to their grand plan. In their greedy, arrogant minds, they had already completely and totally won. That arrogance, however, turned out to be their single biggest and most fatal mistake. They spent so much time meticulously planning my downfall that they never considered the alternative. They never once considered that I might actually be actively planning theirs. A week later, official police search warrants were aggressively executed at their respective properties. Their electronic devices were seized, financial records were collected, and additional forensic evidence was recovered. The criminal investigation rapidly accelerated dramatically under the weight of the new proof. However, neither Julian nor Cressida was actually arrested immediately by the police. Real life rarely works the way it does in dramatic television crime shows. Complex criminal cases take significant time to build properly for the Crown Prosecution Service. voluminous evidence must be thoroughly reviewed, strict procedures followed, and legal rights protected. But the ultimate direction of the legal case was becoming incredibly obvious to everyone involved. And for the very first time since all this nightmare began, I no longer felt afraid. This was because the people who had spent months secretly hunting my future were cornered. They were finally confronting devastating, life-ruining consequences of their own making. The elaborate, deadly trap they had so carefully built for me had finally slammed closed. It had simply closed around the wrong people, trapping them entirely instead of me. 1 year later, I stood on a wooden pier overlooking the vast English Channel. The cold, dark water stretched endlessly toward the distant horizon before me. It beautifully reflected the pale gold light of an early autumn morning on the coast. A brisk, cool breeze moved across the surface, carrying the familiar, salty scent of the sea. For the first time in a very long time, I felt completely at peace within myself. I wasn't ecstatic all the time, and I wasn't perfectly healed completely from the trauma. Life simply doesn't work that way, but I felt genuinely peaceful. And after absolutely everything that had happened, finding that peace felt like a miraculous gift. The complex criminal case had taken nearly 11 months to finally conclude. There were endless hearings, deep investigations, expert testimony, and incredibly detailed forensic analysis. There were endless legal procedures, which is exactly the way the British justice system is supposed to work. Slowly, carefully, and methodically, the crushing evidence grew stronger with each passing month. There were electronic messages, bank records, purchase histories, witness testimony, and irrefutable medical findings. The damning conversation I overheard outside my hospital room was presented separately to the court. None of these single pieces told the entire, horrific story on their own, but when put together, they formed an absolutely devastating picture of premeditated murder. In the end, neither Julian nor Cressida could effectively explain away the hard facts. The jury at the Crown Court certainly couldn't be persuaded by their desperate lies. When the guilty verdicts were finally read aloud, the crowded courtroom remained almost completely silent. There were no dramatic outbursts, no shouting, and no movie-style speeches to the gallery. There was just heavy silence, which is the specific kind that only follows the absolute truth. Julian was firmly convicted on multiple serious charges connected to the elaborate poisoning plot. Cressida was completely convicted of her willing part in the conspiracy as well. The lengthy prison sentences handed down accurately reflected the extreme seriousness of their horrific actions. Neither of them would be walking free in society anytime soon. People often ask me whether I felt intense satisfaction at that specific moment in court. The honest answer is yes, but it wasn't in the exact way most people imagine. I didn't feel joyful, I certainly didn't celebrate, and I didn't even crack a smile. What I truly felt deep in my soul was a profound sense of closure. There is a massive difference between the two highly distinct emotions. Revenge is often portrayed in media as explosive, incredibly loud, highly emotional, and extremely immediate. Real, lasting revenge, however, is usually a much quieter and more subtle affair. Real revenge is simply living long enough to scenery sceneras, scenery, 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 scenerily, scenery wide. Real revenge is resolutely refusing to become the monstrous thing that actively tried to destroy you. That powerful realization came to me gradually over time, not all at once in a flash. The bitter divorce was finally finalized, several months after the high-profile criminal case ended. Legally speaking, there wasn't much left for his barristers to actually argue about anymore. The overwhelming criminal evidence had completely destroyed any remaining illusions he held about his leverage. Julian walked away from our 12-year marriage, with absolutely next to nothing. This wasn't because I illegally manipulated the legal system, nor was it because I unfairly cheated him. It was simply because I fiercely protected what was rightfully mine before he had the chance to steal it. Cruel actions always have severe consequences, and his incredibly severe consequences had finally arrived. The massive Richmond house was officially sold on the open market shortly afterward. That decisive move actually surprised some of my friends and colleagues. The sprawling property was undeniably beautiful, and it held countless seemingly happy memories. But that underlying fact was exactly the root of the entire problem for me. Every single room in that massive house contained heavy, haunting ghosts of the past. Every grand hallway forcefully reminded me of sacred promises that turned out to be nothing but lies. I didn't want to spend the rest of my life living inside a giant museum of betrayal. So, I decisively sold it, and I never looked back at it once. Instead, I quietly purchased a much smaller, charming home closer to central London. It was nothing overly extravagant, and it was certainly nothing designed to actively impress anyone else. It was just a comfortable place that felt deeply peaceful, and a place that finally felt entirely like mine. Meanwhile, the logistics company continued thriving and successfully operating across the country. In fact, it grew significantly larger during the aftermath of the shocking public trial. Several people had asked whether the massive scandal severely damaged the firm's core business. The exact opposite actually happened in the highly competitive corporate market. Our clients deeply respected the absolute transparency I showed during the crisis. My employees respected the incredible strength I displayed while under such immense pressure. Our major investors deeply respected the meticulous preparation and defensive planning I had implemented. Most rational people understand that severe adversity inevitably reveals true character, and a lot of important people had watched exactly how I handled mine. But the most important change in my life had absolutely nothing to do with money, business, or legal victories. It involved finding a brand new, deeply meaningful purpose for my future. Several months after the trial, I attended a conference focused entirely on financial abuse and coercive control in relationships. Originally, I simply planned to sit quietly in the back of the audience and observe. Instead, I found myself captivated, listening to story after heartbreaking story from brave women. Their lives had been nearly destroyed entirely by cruel manipulation and financial deceit. Some had lost their entire life savings, some lost their family homes, and some even lost their businesses. Worse still, some of these brave women had lost entire decades of their lives to abusers. Many had purposely ignored glaring warning signs simply because they truly loved someone. Many had been falsely taught by society that true loyalty always meant keeping silent. Tragically, many of them had wrongly blamed themselves for the abuse they suffered. I clearly recognized painful pieces of my own lived experience in every single heartbreaking story. And sitting there in that hall, I realized something incredibly important about my privileged position. I had vast resources that most normal people simply don't have access to. I had brilliant solicitors, private investigators, and highly skilled financial advisors at my disposal. Many victims of such abuse never receive that kind of elite, life-saving support. So, I boldly decided to actually do something concrete to help change that sad reality. A few months later, I proudly established a charitable foundation to address the issue. It actively provides free legal assistance and essential financial education for vulnerable individuals. It specifically targets those facing financial exploitation within toxic, abusive relationships. It is nothing massive, and it certainly isn't anything overly flashy or corporate. It just provides highly practical help, real help, and the exact kind that genuinely changes lives one person at a time. The first woman we successfully helped was a single mother from Yorkshire. Her abusive husband had secretly accumulated enormous, crippling debt entirely in her name. The second person we aided was a retired teacher whose cruel partner had been systematically stealing her hard-earned pension funds. Then there were more cases, and more pouring in every week. Each devastating story firmly reminded me exactly why mere survival truly matters in this world. Because surviving your own horrific ordeal gives you the precious opportunity to help someone else survive theirs, too. One quiet afternoon, nearly a full year after the guilty verdicts were handed down, I received a letter. It had no return address on the envelope, and absolutely no explanation was provided. Inside was a very short, handwritten note from a woman I'd never actually met before. She stated that she had recently attended one of our foundation's financial workshops. The final, powerful sentence of her brief letter stayed with me long after I read it. She wrote, "You helped me finally trust myself again." I read that simple line several times over, letting the immense weight of it sink in. Then I folded the letter very carefully and placed it safely inside my desk drawer. I did this because, in many profound ways, that single sentence captured absolutely everything I had painfully learned. You must always trust yourself above all else when things feel wrong. The subtle warning signs always matter, and your gut instincts always matter deeply. The deeply uncomfortable feeling you simply can't explain often matters far more than anything else. It matters infinitely more than the logical explanation you're desperately searching for to comfort yourself. Looking back on everything now, I don't think the most important moment of this entire story happened in the hospital. I don't think it happened in the Crown Court, or even during the final reading of the verdict. I truly think the most important moment actually happened much earlier than all of that. It was the exact moment I finally stopped dismissing my own entirely valid concerns. It was the crucial moment I bravely chose the harsh truth over maintaining a comfortable lie. It was the exact moment I firmly decided that aggressively protecting myself wasn't a selfish act at all. It was a completely, absolutely, and undeniably necessary act for my own survival. As I stood on the wooden pier that brisk morning, watching the waves move across the sea, my mobile phone buzzed. It was a new text message from Gideon that popped up on the screen. He wrote that the Foundation's annual report looked absolutely incredible, and he was very proud of me. I smiled warmly at the screen, and then quickly typed out a heartfelt response to him. I replied that I simply couldn't have done any of it without him by my side. A moment later, another text message arrived, this time from Alistair. He simply asked if I was free for lunch in the city next week. I laughed out loud into the sea breeze and typed back, absolutely. I then slipped the mobile phone safely back into my coat pocket and looked out toward the distant horizon once more. For many years, I foolishly believed that true success meant constantly building wealth, building massive companies, and building social status. I was entirely wrong about that definition for most of my adult life. True success is actually building a strong life that remains firmly standing after severe betrayal tries to violently tear it down. Julian and Cressida greedily wanted absolutely everything I had worked so hard for. They wanted my successful logistics company, my hard-earned money, and my entire future. In the end, because of their wicked greed, they completely lost their own futures instead. And in the terrible aftermath, I gained something far more valuable than simple revenge could ever provide. I gained true, absolute, and unshakable freedom for the rest of my life. If there's only one crucial lesson to be learned in my entire story, it's exactly this. You must never, ever confuse someone's simple kindness with exploitable weakness. You must never ignore the dire warnings that your own instincts are desperately trying to tell you. And you must never underestimate the immense power of truth, thorough preparation, and extreme patience. Because while justice may take a significant amount of time to finally materialize, its arrival is absolute. But when it finally does arrive, it doesn't just ruthlessly expose exactly who other people truly are. It also beautifully and powerfully reveals exactly who you are, too. If this deeply personal story moved you in any way, I'd absolutely love to hear your thoughts on it. Have you ever dangerously ignored a warning sign and later wished you'd trusted your instinct much sooner? Or perhaps have you faced a terrible betrayal and somehow found a way to successfully rebuild your life afterward? Please feel free to openly share your own perspective in the comments section below. Your unique lived experience may very well help someone else who desperately needs some encouragement today. And if you genuinely enjoy thoughtful, true stories about human resilience, seeking justice, and finding second chances, please consider subscribing. We would love for you to join us on the channel for our very next incredible journey. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my story today.